Okay, first review for the week is going to be The Corrupted Core, The Dungeon of Stories, book number 1, written by John Stovall. It is 394 pages, $4.98. It's available on Kindle Unlimited, and here's the author's description. The first rank 4 dungeons ever born. An unusually talented party of adventurers both must face a terror to destroy the kingdom that came before them. Will is the newest in a long line of dungeons born into the world, and is a rank higher than any dungeon that preceded. He's born along with 7 other dungeons in a small area, but so many dungeons were born in one place because of a magical disaster. A disaster brought by the Voidbringers who sought to conquer the world. Now the unthinkable has happened, the Voidbringers have returned, and they have the ability to corrupt dungeons. As a powerful dungeon, Will is one of their targets. He comes under the assault by their minions, has to deal with the aggressive neighboring dungeons, and of course adventurers. With the aid of his dungeon fairy Amber and the adventuring party run by Gar Adamant, displaced prince of the kingdom destroyed by the Voidbringers, Will must grow his dungeon to become as strong as possible as he possibly can, grow his nearby town, defend himself from locals, and fend off enemies surrounding him everywhere. A dungeon core story. Okay, this... It says it's a dungeon core story, but only about 30-ish% of it is actually a traditional dungeon core story that has a perspective from the dungeon. The rest of the story really actually follows the other named character in the novel description, the Dwarven Prince, and his adventures going in and out of the dungeon, getting a crew together, establishing a dungeon town to kind of recreate a declining kingdom and help prop that up. Finding other adventurers and dealing with politics with the other nations, elves, elvish factions, whatever the case is. And so there's a lot of that stuff there. And that actually takes up the majority of the story, with the ending, this isn't spoilery, but dealing with the other big adversity problem with the other dungeon, which is mentioned again in the novel description. So that's pretty much what the story is. I'd say, again, that the dungeon core portion of this is kind of the disappointing section, unfortunately. Not that it's poorly written, not that it's a badly told story, or that the mechanics, the actual mechanics are fairly detailed, and there is definitely thought put into them, so I give the author props for that. But there's nothing there that I haven't read before, and that's kind of what it comes down to. I enjoy the story, but the dungeon core portion of it just wasn't bad. It's just I'd read all those concepts before. It felt like the author is a fan of dungeon core stories, and he's read quite a few, and he kind of plucked out or was inspired by other popular stories, and he kind of pulled similar ideas and incorporated into his own dungeon core story. So you're seeing a lot of influences from other popular series, like the dungeon who wakes up and he has a dungeon fairy next to him, and he starts expanding, and some of the monster choices are like listed their evolutions, the elemental affinity sections. And again, none of it's done badly. It's just that, okay, I read that. Even the big bad, conflict with the next dungeon who's trying to corrupt him or take over. I've read that multiple times. I've read a lot of dungeon core stories too. And so I see all those influences. And again, they're not badly done. It's just that, nothing really special here on that front. Now, on the other front of the story, essentially the fantasy progression story. There's RPG progression on the entire story, both on the dungeon side and on the adventure side, so it is RPG, no questions there. But the other point of view from the Dwarven Prince, now that actually was a little more entertaining, at least until for most of the story, I should say. And that's mostly because that's where you get your world building done, because that character is not restricted to the dungeon. That's the character who has an opportunity to have a character progression arc, because he's interacting with other species, other characters, other adventurers, other characters. So there's he gets to do that. He also has there's also opportunity in this story to do some actual world building from other point of views from other characters. A little bit of politics in the story, which is always a nice little layer. And that section, even though it isn't what I came for with this dungeon core story, was still fairly entertaining, and that felt a little more original, because it had its own unique characters, it had dialogue, and it kind of was able to go in its own direction up until at least the end big conflict, which again was fairly predictable. Again, because it's pulled from inspired from other very popular dungeon core stories. So for the most part, nothing really bad to say about the story. Again, solid game mechanics. there is definitely a lot of thought put into them, and I can appreciate the theory system that the author used and incorporated and show the course thought processes in min-maxing, or at least in developing his resource system and the efficiency there, and that his plan was to expand, all kinds of good stuff there. But again, mechanics that I've seen before. The arc was predictable because I read this stuff and it could not bad. It's just nothing that really wowed me. So overall, not a bad story. Fairly solid, little bitty dungeon core story, and fairly entertaining. Just nothing that really wowed me. Gets a score of 7.3 out of 10, which is again a positive. It's a good score. But if you've read other dungeon core stories, like, oh, this is going to feel extra familiar for the dungeon core parts, and also the dungeon core parts aren't the majority of this story. So just be aware of that. That's The Corrupted Core, Dungeon of Stories, book number 1, with a score of 7.3 out of 10.